Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. Today is Wednesday, September 16th. This is the InfoMullet Ask Me Anything on Facebook. I'm Timothy Clancy, your Chief Mulleteer, and this is Bonky, our emotional support donkey. We're joined today, not really in studio, but in Zoom. We're joined in Zoom by Raafat Zaini, who is a colleague of mine at WPI. He has a PhD in system dynamics and organizational design, and he's a simulation modeler working in system dynamics, does a lot of work in organizational design, dissent. He's done research at MIT, and he's built a very simple but very powerful simulation model of the COVID-19 pandemic that I've been talking about for months, called the SIR model. And I've invited Raafat in to share that today to walk us through and kind of help us understand, while we're still dealing with this, really getting down into the system structure of how these pandemics are put together, how they work, and how even simple simulation models can give you a lot of insight. So again, if for those, we do 2 InfoMullets a month. So the first one was more about the presidential campaign and sort of domestic and international affairs. The second of the month is going to be more about COVID. That's what this one is. We'll start off with an update of where we're at in the world and pandemic response, and then jump right over to Raafat so we can give him the most time. If you haven't, go ahead and share this video out to anyone who might have questions about COVID, how it works, how different parts of the pandemic work. We'll be getting to the simulation models on that. And as always, greatly appreciate all our mulleteers. If you haven't become a Patreon yet, consider checking out www.patreon.com/infomullet. $5 a month will let you be a subscriber, help our efforts, and we'll pay for this fantastic studio backdrop that you see Raafat has there, which he provided himself when we're not reimbursing him for. But no, thank you seriously for everyone who's a mulleteer and a senior mulleteer. We really appreciate it. Again, www.patreon.com/infomullet, and we're going to jump right into it. Throughout it, if you have questions, please leave them in the comments. Facebook's being a little bit weird with the comments. They're much more delayed than usual, but I will try and get them and ask them to Raafat. But I wanted to start us off with kind of a global update it's been about a month since we last talked about COVID-19, and I wanted to show people where we're at in the US and abroad. So we're going to start out with the view that everyone but Sweden has come to love and Sweden has come to hate. But this is some charts I do on pandemic responses. So there's 100 and 200 countries in the world. They're all struggling with the pandemic to varying degrees. There are 4 general responses that we track, and we've been tracking them over time. And I want to give an update because the last one I gave was August 4th, so it's been about a month and a half. 2 charts that we'll go through here. Just to clear the chart so everyone's familiar, on the left, we have daily new cases per 100,000 over a 7-day moving average. So again, that's a per capita adjustment. That means these charts are reflective of the population, that not the countries we're displaying have very different population sizes, but by using a per capita 100,000, we've normalized them so we can put them on the same. And it's a 7-day moving average. So we take the average over 7 days and do it. On the bottom is the days since the first confirmed case. This is how we do it at the InfoMullet, so we can track the path of the pandemic in different countries as it broke out. But because the pandemic broke out at different times, not all the lines at the end are going to align. And what we have here are the 4 general responses that we see countries adopting or attempting in different parts around the world. And again, for review, in green is the hammer and dance model that we've talked a lot about. We've chosen Germany as a representative example. It's a large land-based, not an island or something like that, but it's a large, very developed economy country with a lot of people in it. It's not a small country. It's using the hammer and dance. The pandemic panopticon in brown is that South Korea. Again, it's obviously a part of a peninsula, but it's not an island. It's got travel. It's a very economically advanced, large country. Induced herd immunity, which they tend not to like that phrase, although half of them still use it. But this is a model which skewed some of the approaches of the other countries, and so we keep them as an example to see sort of what happens when you don't do the lockdown. Maybe they've got the best idea. Maybe they're doing it right and the rest of us are doing it wrong. So we include Sweden. And then, of course, the thoughts and prayers approach, which is the United States, which is sort of like this mix match of and what you can see here is over time, you've got some really interesting behavior patterns now, in that you have South Korea was the first one to have an outbreak, and they had a very small outbreak, and it's been virtually flat ever since. So the pandemic panopticon by far is the most effective response I think we've seen, because you catch it early, you stop it early, you never have a real outbreak. Germany, with the hammer and the dance, it experienced a very significant outbreak. This was not a small, you're talking seven per 100,000 people over however many hundreds of millions, or 100-something million that Germany has. Maybe it's 80 million. That's a large number of people. But they put the hammer in place. The hammer went down. They've dropped the daily cases very, very low, and they've opened it back up, and they're in dance. So Germany is now a much more open economy. We talk about, well, we can't stay locked down forever. Germany's an example of alternating between this hammer and the dance. And you can see their cases have risen in the last couple weeks since we last did this. They are rising as we head into fall. That's concerning, but that's part of the hammer and the dance. As we're going to see with Raafat later, you're never eliminating all the cases unless you get a true containment, and that's pretty difficult unless you're on an island these days. In the red is Sweden, and Sweden had this approach where they didn't lock down. They kept the country not open on the borders, but open with inside. They did some social distancing. They had some rules like, no more than so many people in a bar. The sports events were shut down. But for the most part, they went on. They continued school. They continued business interactions at a full pace. And you can see here their daily cases got pretty high, jumped up, and only recently has really dropped back down, and dropped back down to a very low level. They're actually now trading places with Germany on a per capita basis, which is pretty impressive given where they're at. So, I mean, that's a good sign. But again, these are all dynamics over time. It's not a point in time, but over time. And then, of course, we have the US here with this double hump formation that I've been talking about for months, that we had one peak that began, and it never really ended. The peak never completed. It died down a little and then jumped up to this second hump, this wave 1.5, where it's peaked and it's dropped. But in the last couple of days, somewhat of a worrying sign, things are starting to increase again. And why this still matters is I do not think this pandemic is over, and the good days of summer are behind us. We're now entering flu season in the fall. It hits the US October, November, December, sometime around there, the flu is going to break out. And if we're still having bad numbers from COVID at the same time the flu happens, we're going to be in a world of hurt. Now, this is the daily new cases. So this is showing sort of the current cases, but we also have the deaths. And you can see here in the US, this is a track of our deaths per day. We've seen this chart before. On the left is the daily deaths in an absolute number, and that's what these blue columns are. The bottom is the calendar, and the red line is a 7-day moving average of the deaths to kind of smooth out a little bit. We know there's that weekend effect where deaths go down on the weekend because of reporting, they pop back up. We have two outliers that are highlighted here. This is when there were significant revisions and a large number of deaths were added that weren't attributed to any day, just dumped in one day. So we've called that out here for New York and New Jersey. But I think the big news since the last time we did this, which was in August, is we've had, I hate to say it, but we warned for months that if wave 1.5 happened again, we'd be up over, this 500,000 level. And we've been there now for all the way through August, and we're still around 800 to 900 on average. It drops down for the weekends, but we just had another 1,500 death day. And as a result, the US right now is looking at 195,000 deaths. That means at the current clip, probably by Monday or Tuesday, we'll be over 200,000 deaths in the US. Not a good outcome, and probably one of the worst outcomes in the world, given where we're at as a developed economy. We should have had this handled. But from a pandemic response, when we look at the per capita deaths and compare them, it's interesting here because this gives you, new cases is one measure, but deaths are also what you've lost. So the deaths per 100,000, we track these here on the left to clear the chart. Deaths per 100,000 people, again, a normalized measure. The bottom, the days since first confirmed case. We'll go through the pandemic responses. Pandemic panopticon, again, probably the best, most effective pandemic response that we've seen. It's not clear it could be easily done in the West because of privacy laws, data laws. There's a lot of data collection, a lot of data sharing. You're basically exposing the entire society to data harvesting, but very effective in South Korea. Hammer and the dance, this is important here. Even though they have had, a slight resurgence in cases, the hammer and the dance has showed that Germany was able to keep its per capita death rate. They're at 11. It's not great. It's not nearly as good as South Korea, but it's 11. When you look at the other options, this induced herd immunity option for Sweden, it was actually much worse than the US for a long period of time. It had a huge, and this just goes through it doesn't sound like much. They've only had, they've had under 10,000 deaths, I think, at this point. But in a small country like Sweden, when you don't have a lot of people, that's a lot per capita. And people are saying, well, it's all old people. Well, it's not. It's only like 50, 60%. That's a lot of people who are not old that are also dying too. And from a per capita rate, the US, as bad as we've been doing, we just crossed Sweden's threshold only in the last 2 weeks. So if you think about the US deaths per capita, even as we've been losing all those people, the equivalent proportional share of the population, we're just now catching up to where Sweden was back in June when their super spreader or their peak event faded. So that's where we're at right now from a pandemic standpoint. And I wanted to take a pause here, go through any questions, do some introductions, and then we'll jump into Raafat, who's going to explain, all this data we're looking at, these sort of curves. He's going to explain how the pandemic system structure creates this. So hello, Chris, Greg, Charles, Lucas, thanks for joining. Laura says, get your flu shots. Absolutely agree, Laura. Lucas is saying early intervention in a public health crisis is essential, and it is cheaper and more effective than fixing it once it's broke. This is what the data shows. The pandemic panopticon really means that South Korea is an entirely different data state than the rest of us. They're not dealing with a mass outbreak. Yeah, they're not dealing with mass deaths. After that, the hammer and the dance is, again, an order of magnitude better than other ones. Lucas says we would effectively emulate a pandemic panopticon strategy if we had sufficient testing and public health infrastructure or the will to build it. Possibly, Lucas. I don't know what the data sharing, like one of the things in South Korea that I think makes it effective is they can share who has the virus where, so that you can sort of socially choose to isolate around the person rather than quarantining the city. You just know in that building or that floor, there's someone who has the pandemic and you're able to navigate around there. But certainly it goes without saying that having massive amounts of testing early, often, and sustained, as well as having that contact tracing. I mean, we talked months ago how South Korea had an outbreak where something like 1,500 people were exposed in a single night. And they were on top of it in 3 to 4 days. They had contact tracing down. Those people self-quarantined. That's the kind of capabilities we need in the US, and we're nowhere near it. And Laura's pointing out, these are the official COVID death counts that I'm doing it. And she's pointing out the excess date rate far higher. Any thoughts on the undercounted deaths? I think, it's one of those things that I've been going for a ballpark number that we're probably undercounting COVID deaths by about 15%. That's not as high as some estimates. It's not as high as the undercounted rate. What Laura's talking about, for those who haven't seen it, is every year we have a good average of how many deaths there are in the US every month, every day. We track that pretty well. You combine the last 20 years of data, you get a good average amount. And you can say, are we significantly higher than that average death rate? And does that correlate to an undercount? Like, is that difference between the average and where we're at now the true count of COVID? I think that's a good measure for discussion. I don't know if it's a great precise measure, but it's probably more important for like an order of magnitude that we're probably undercounting. It's probably higher than we have right now. Is it exactly as high as an undercount rate? I don't think so. There's a lot of other things going on, that are because of the pandemic with the quarantine, but I think it's pretty indicative that the official number remains undercounted. And we've talked about that in the past. So I don't go as high as the full excess count rate. I tend to say that we're probably undercounting by about 15%, which means that ballpark we're in the 220,000 death rate right now. But I wanted to get to Raafat because what he's got today is kind of a special treat for us. Raafat works in system dynamics as I do, and he's actually built, we've talked about since very in January when I first started talking about COVID-19, I've mentioned this model, SIR, a SIR model, and using that, all the knowledge I got for the pandemic early on was aided by a systems thinking understanding and a simulation understanding of this pandemic model. Raafat's been generous enough to take his time today and join us and walk us through a bunch of things about this pandemic structure, how the model works, how we look at dynamic behavior, how we be good consumers of data. So what we're going to do is something a little different today. Is I'm going to go into facilitator mode. I'm going to stop yapping and talking. We're going to hand it over to Raafat, and he's going to walk us through quite a bit. Now, at any point, you can ask questions. I'll ping them over to Raafat, and I'll be asking some questions as well. So without further ado, Raafat, do you have anything you want to add before we get started? I have Bonky. Do you have an emotional support animal on your side? This is kind of a tough topic today.
Thank you, because Arnab was waiting patiently for somebody to acknowledge him. He's not good as Bonky to stay still because Arnab tends to jump.
What
Sorry, what was that?
What is his name?
Arnab, which is rabbit.
Ah, good. He needs some phone books. You need to put some phone books so he can see over the top.
Catch up, but once he got up to a certain level, he will start jumping around. Just say hi to the volunteers and just leave, and
okay.
He'd be my emotional support.
Thank you. We've got the emotional support donkey, the emotional support rabbit. Let's get started.
He says hi to Bonky. Thank you for having me, and for the volunteers who joined us today. And yeah, so talking about data and what you shared, Tim, this is very insightful and helpful. And yeah, I'm gonna pick up from where you started, if you don't mind. So I'll be sharing my screen.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, and so I'll go ahead. And do you see my screen?
I see it now.
Okay, so you see the chart in the back on that screen. This is Tim's chart.
Are you saying that's me surrounded by all this data?
Yeah, but you're doing a good job interpreting this data, not like this gentleman who's surrounded by those piles of charts. I mean, not necessarily on paper. They're on our phones or tablets or our screens. And, somebody's asking him that he has to do something. He has to come up with a solution or an action. And he's just staring at them. And this is somehow a situation. So I'd like to thank you for what you're doing. Bringing all those charts and doing all these interpretation, because that's pretty much the question of, in order to know what to do with the data, we need to understand why they behave the way they do. They're acting or they're representing a phenomenon. And that brings us to the talk about dynamic behavior that we will use to explain what's happening with the pandemic. So to begin with, what is a dynamic behavior? It's a phenomena that changes over time. Something that changes over time that, I mean, I'm not gonna repeat the charts you explained with the x-axis of number of cases and the y-axis of time, but something like this is what we call a dynamic phenomena. These are different charts, and this is partly what you showed about the US in terms of the daily cases. And we've heard about all the terms: exponential growth, reaching the peak, declining cases, flattening the curve, and most recently also the second wave. Those are terms that we typically hear in the news, or the minute we look at those charts. For example, that's the growth part of this particular chart, where cases are increasing over time, or there is a decline in the number of cases over time, or sometimes oscillations, which sometimes attributed to a certain phenomena like weekends or whatever, depending on the time scale or the averaging that is used. But these are all dynamic phenomena that's happening over time. And to understand what causes them to happen or to act the way they do, we will use the COVID as our story to bring us to the understanding of the underlying structure of that. So our story goes, and I think that's very familiar. A COVID-19 story started with a case. If you see down the bottom here in the chart, you see a case of COVID started. More cases came from different locations, which increases the infectious population. I'm going to explain what that is, but we can just see that it increased from 1 to 10 over a period of time. We call this pipe a flow. and we call this box a stock. So these cases were collected here and, or gathered. Definitely, when they are in a certain place, if they live in a community, this makes the community a susceptible population, or people who are susceptible to be infected by those. But since they're separate, nothing is happening. The numbers are the same. However, the link between the two, if they start mixing, is what we call is the infection rate. When cases of people who are susceptible will become infectious, and that takes us to something that we know or we have seen at this curve, which looked like, I mean, we're not seeing here, it looks like a zero here, but it's not a zero. It's actually a number that has increased from, but we only can observe it when it starts shooting up. I mean, this is exaggerated here just for the sake of presenting the model is showing it to you here. But that's a result of what we call the contagion loop, the infectious population infecting the susceptible population. And the more susceptible, the more infectious population, the more there is an infection. And we have this contagion loop, or what we call a reinforcing loop. The question comes, will this growth continue forever? I mean, we know already that probably it won't, because that's why we see that there is somehow an equilibrium at a certain point. And the reason why this doesn't continue to grow is because as there are more people infected, there are less people susceptible. And we call this a balancing loop, which is simply balancing the growth, stopping the growth from continuing.
And let me just stop you real quick on that chart in the bottom right. The susceptible is the red dashed line. That's actually showing the population that's in that stock box susceptible, and the blue line is showing the population in that infectious. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And rightly, as you pointed out, we can see that the susceptible, which is this dashed line, is dropping, and that's why this line, the blue line, doesn't continue to grow. So there is dynamics between the two. As this increases or decreases, this stops growing. But what happens next? Those folks, will they remain infectious forever? This is also no. Those infectious will either recover or they die. They call it either removed or they're recovered. Hopefully they're recovered more than they're removed or they die. And that's when we see a drop in that chart, is because we're draining this stock of infectious population, and that we call it also a balancing loop, which is the removal of those folks to become removed. And with this, I mean, we can see that how this went from growth to an equilibrium to a decline.
Now we've only got, I see that there's only 10,000 people in this simulation. What is this simulating? Is this simulating a town, a country? What are we modeling here?
Yeah, the numbers here are just representative, but it could be like a county or so. It's not like a country, but it's just numbers that we won't use to demonstrate the idea. So it's not like an exact place, but it can be, could represent a county, because something that we have to say is that we're assuming perfect mixing. So that's why all the susceptible population will get infected.
What does perfect mixing mean for those who might not be familiar?
Well, some people choose to stay home. Some people choose to go outside. In that community, there are homes that are located in the far side, like the countryside. It's different from a populous city where people living in apartment buildings or in long-term care facilities where they're seeing each other daily, twice a day, 3 times a day. So that's the perfect mixing.
Got it.
We're talking about here. So to go down, as I promised, to explain the dynamic behavior and what causes that, the dynamic behavior which we have seen, which is this growth and decline, is basically generated from 3 feedback loops. And we already touched on that, mentioning that there is a reinforcing feedback loop, increasing infection by infecting susceptibles. So we can see this, the more infectious, the more there's infection rate, and this is responsible for the growth part. We've also seen reaching that peak here is that when this loop kicks off, which is the balancing loop, where there is it puts limits to growth of the infection. So it reaches this point, then kicks the balancing loop, which is the which decreases the infectious population. And they're not acting at the same time just because people need time to recover.
That is such an important thing that I think is missed when people, when they don't think about this as a system, they're only thinking about like who's getting infected right now or who's getting removed. They forget that this is all connected and it's happening over time, that it takes time for people to get infected, that exponential growth to then hit its stride. And even then it takes time for the recovery to go out. And so there's this, what I've noticed over the last couple months, and if you can talk about it as you go through, this factor of time is so hard for people to understand. And what I like about this model is it shows really this left to right. We start at susceptible, we go to removed, and there's time through that. It takes time and what's going to happen over time. So I really like this view.
Thank you, Tim. So rightly, as you mentioned, so especially if we look, for example, if we look at this period when there are growing number of cases, but at the same time, the removed or the death or recovery is very small. So people would think there's nothing happening because they don't feel what's the downstream of what's happening, whether it's death, it comes later in time. So it's very hard to compare on the same day deaths and cases, because death or recovery will come with a delay. It will take some time to show up. And this is when this balancing loop acts. It acts with a delay, which is the time it takes for people to recover. So with this, we can conclude that this behavior results from a structure that is understandable, even if these diagrams will look different. As you can see here, they might be sharp and high, or they look more flat.
Are those just different types of curves that this model can produce for infections?
Yes, and we're going to talk about them more in detail or demo them as when we talk about the model. And as I said, this is a simple susceptible infected removed SIR model, which is an epidemiological model that was developed in the beginning of the 20th century. So, but we're using this method of simulating that model for you. So that's based on the literature. It's not something that I made up.
So this seems like you mentioned it's a simple model. This seems like a really simple model. How would I use this to be a good, to understand? Is it if I'm a health county expert and I'm trying to plan for my hospital capacity, or would I use something this simple? Can it get more complex?
Oh yeah, sure. So yeah, not all models are created equal, and also we will not leave it at that. We will also say that all models serve different purposes. So the purpose from doing this model is to understand the dynamic behavior, how this phenomena happens, how it can start like a fire and how it is extinguished. So it's a model for understanding. It's not a policy model that shows up hospitals, different locations, geographical locations, or age groups or venues. It's just, as I mentioned, it assumes perfect mixing, but those susceptibles are always there. The infectious will always be there, and the removed will be always there.
Could you add that detail if you wanted to? If you wanted to make this model, you want to have age demographics, different cohorts, have geographic segmentation. Could you build upon this model?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. We have a question, by the way. Lucas Hill, who is an epidemiologist or a lab scientist working on COVID, he asked, does his SIR model account for expiration of post-infection protection where people return to being in the susceptible population? I think, so that's a great question. What Lucas is asking for the folks watching is, the model shows a left to right. Everyone's susceptible, they all get infected, which is a little bit unrealistic, but it's a simple model, and then they all get removed because they're recovered or they've died. Lucas is asking if there's anything that represents in this simulation right now, the removed going back to susceptible, which is the key question when it comes to antibodies and T-cell immunities and all these things that we talk about, like how long am I going to be protected? I got COVID myself. I was in the hospital. I'm in the removed population because I'm recovered. But if my resistance drops, do I go back to being susceptible? Let's hold that till we get into the live model, and we might be able to simulate that to actually see what happens there. So we're going to hold that question for now. And again, if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to ask them, and I'll jump in with Raafat and get them answered. But go ahead, Raafat, if you want to continue here.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And the first answer that this current model doesn't, but we can explore that further. And this is also called a compartmental model. Compartmental is that you see these groups, distinct groups, the susceptible, infectious, and removed population. There are different versions of such models. Some of them, as you, Tim, suggested, can be disaggregated by region and age groups, and some has variables or variables that are affected over time. So this means their values changes. So there are so many complexities that can be added, but the core model remains the same because it relies on that epidemiological model that everybody is basing their work on, which is this IR model.
Well, let's dig in a little more on what components of this core model are. Let's break this core model apart and go a little deeper,
yes,
if you can.
Thank you, Tim. So the next thing that comes after that is what makes such models. What are the main components of these models? So if we're thinking about the systems thinking concepts that upon which such models are built, such simulation models are built, is the concept of stocks and flows and feedback loops. And we'll start with the first one, which is the stock and flow. So the stocks and flows, as I introduced earlier, is this box is the stock, the inflow is this pipe that you see coming in, and the outflow, which is draining this, is coming out. And I will use what we call is the bathtub analogy, which is, and let me bring back the case of COVID, the COVID model that we have seen. The inflow of that you see, this tap water, this is the inflow of cases. This is the infection rate coming in and filling in the stock, and the stock will be the infectious population in this case. And the outflow that we see here, represented by the drain from the bathtub, this is the people recovering or dying. So that's why we see that.
So from a COVID standpoint, how you would relate this to the charts? You know, so total infected at any point in time, that would be a stock. That's the level of water in the bathtub.
Yes, exactly.
And this daily new cases, daily death rates, daily recoveries, those are all inflows or outflows, either adding to the bathtub or taking it away.
Exactly. So that would be the daily cases is the inflow, and the daily recovery or daily death will be the outflow. And the level is the number of cases.
I've read somewhere in some places that the stock or this level represents kind of a memory of a system. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So it's a memory because it is the way the position it reached, or that level, is basically from actions that preceded that. And it's not also easy either to bring it down, because there need to be action that help removes that. So it's not something that changes instantaneously, and it is something that is a result or an outcome of actions that took place at a certain period of time that precedes the level.
So kind of like when I put the Germany and US charts up, the Germany chart of, say, deaths per capita, that's a memory of all the policy actions that Germany did or did not take, just like the US is a memory of all the actions that the US did or didn't take going back to January. So it's almost like a record you know, and it's not exactly clear what those actions were. You can't tell them from seeing it, but in some ways it's kind of like the current level of cases we have now is a reflection of everything we've done or not done since January. Would that be fair?
Yes. Definitely.
Interesting, fascinating. So that makes the level a really powerful comparison tool because it encapsulates all these different things at a sort of a simple level. Now we've got a question here from, I'm going to get this name wrong, but Peru Peridir. If we want to go through different age groups and susceptible, should we define different stocks and different infection rates that are all connected to the infected stock, or is it better to define a function within the susceptible stock variable? I think what he's asking is a disaggregation. Would we, if we have different age cohorts, or we want to segment these compartments, would we represent them as different stocks, or we'd have one function like a curve in the one stock to represent that?
So in this methodology, it's easy to just create like a subscript or a matrix. So it's the same stock that we can see, but imagine that this is age 90 plus, and there is behind it another box that says from age 80 to 85. So they go through the same piping, if you will, but they have separate tanks.
Got it. Great answer.
Go through. So it can be simply presented. It doesn't need to be very sophisticated.
Please continue.
So just to explain the dynamic phenomena, we don't want to get just the COVID thing in and out, but if the inflow or the flow of the number of cases is the same as the number of deaths, then we typically have nothing is changing. The stock level will just remain constant. And this is what you see sometimes in the charts, that you see it leveling at some point. This is that like daily cases is equal to the daily removed. So you won't see that many changes. I mean, one thing I need to also to make clear, when we talk about data, we have to know that when the data is measured is different from when the data is reported. So that's why we have to use some of these analogies by being cautious, because it also depends on how fast the data is collected, how accurate, and how fast the data is reported.
Good point. A great caveat.
And when the inflow is greater than the outflow, that means the number of cases is still coming up, but the death or recovery is still is less. Mm-hmm. This is when we see the growth pattern happening. And as we mentioned, that it takes time for recovery or for death. Nothing is happening instantaneously, even if there are some. And when the inflow is less than the outflow, I think you guessed it, this is when we see a decline. So these are the two actions that is happening and responsible for the increase or decrease of those curves. Mm-hmm. And yeah, there is a math behind that, which is the integral equations, or what Tim has mentioned, this memory. So the level of the stock of number of cases is depending on the number of cases before, plus the number of new cases minus the cases that recovered or died, multiplied by the unit of time, and then depends whether you're using a day or a week or whatever.
So a sort of a simple way of saying that is the total cases of current infected at any point in time equals the cases from yesterday plus new cases minus recovered cases, correct?
Exactly.
So this is calculus. This isn't statistics. This is built on calculus, correct?
Exactly.
Great. I've got a question here from Lucas. I want to hold it so we can, I think we'll get into when we jump a little bit more into the model, we can ask that one. Please continue.
Okay, so this some examples of stocks and flows, because we don't want to keep stocks and flows only for COVID. For example, in the physical systems, if we talk about the water in the ocean, that's a stock. We know it's like 70% of the earth is water in oceans, etc. And it evaporates to become water in the clouds, and then it condenses, and then it precipitates, and it comes back as a rain. So this is a physical phenomena that stocks and flows represent. Another thing that could be represented by stocks and flows is, for example, body weight. We gain weight through...
That's my favorite one. I love that one there.
I mean, it reminds me of so many things about myself. So gaining weight and losing weight. And we know that if the rate of gaining weight is faster than the rate of losing weight, then what we're gonna have is end up having
So I think, I mean, I think this is a really good example here because everyone can kind of relate to the struggles of, it's easier to gain weight and put yourself on the wrong track of body weight. And just because on the day after New Year's, you decide, I'm going to go about and lose weight, it takes time. And this is that memory function. Your current body weight is a reflection of all the choices you've made in the recent and not so recent past, the habits, the exercise, things like that. You can't just turn that on a dime and have it, you know, lose 20 pounds, if only that were the case. But I think this is really important. We talk about almost like inertia. When our own pandemic response in COVID, even though we, you know, it's not going to just turn on a dime and think people like, well, we'll be fine. You know, we'll just, if things get serious, we'll just do it. It takes a lot of inertia to change your momentum that you're already heading in. And anyone who's tried to lose weight after gaining it knows it's much harder to lose the weight than it is to gain it. And I think this gets to Lucas's point about early interventions being much more effective to avoid gaining the weight or getting the COVID case in the first place. Sorry, I interrupted you. What's going on with anger? What's happening there?
Good that you caught me before I get angry. So anger also works the same way. We have things that makes you angry, so they build up anger, and also things that makes you less angry, which is like venting. This is one of the coping mechanisms. So to prevent anger, I mean, to intervene with anger, it's not only by venting. We can also control the way we perceive things, the way we react to things, so we can intervene. So this is one of the beauty of showing the flows, because flows is where you can intervene. With stocks, you can't touch them on their own. It's either I take myself away from things that makes me angry, or if I get anger, because this is something uncontrollable that's happened to me suddenly, then I know the coping mechanisms that helps me reduce my anger. And the time to, if somebody has, when they call anger issues, this means they get triggered quickly. So the time to build anger is much shorter than the time to vent. So they remain angry for a longer period of time. So despite whether we can control this or not, but this shows us that we can do something about anger. If that shows what the power of the flows and stocks is. Any questions? Or we can continue?
Let's continue. I think you've got feedback, and then we're going to get in the model. I know Lucas has a question about there's some questions coming about the SRR model. So let's go with the feedback, and then we can get into the.
Keep the questions, and I hope that the viewers will wait for us, but we just have to finish this one more concept before we head to the model. So I talked about the positive feedback loops or the reinforcing feedback loops, which is in simply saying an action creates a result which influences more of that action. To say it, which I better says it with diagrams rather than words, that if the variable A increases, it leads to an increase in the variable B. And if B increases, A increases, and vice versa. So that's a reinforcing loop. These two actions keep increasing. The second concept is the negative feedback loop, or the balancing feedback loop that we talked about, where an action represents an attempt to achieve a goal or to close a gap. So this means I won't grow forever. There is a limit. If I reach it, I will stop. And also if I show it with a diagram, an increase in one variable, say A, will lead to a decrease in the other variable, and so on. So that this means this loop will not grow forever. It will reach a limit and stop. And that's what a negative feedback loop or a balancing feedback loop is. And I will give an examples, not to keep it cryptic like this.
Right. Let's move through the examples quickly, because we're getting a rest. We're building anger in the audience. So let's.
Okay, so let's go away from the COVID, or we go to fishing. A feedback and a positive feedback loop is for fishes. The more fish we have, the more birth or recruitment. That's a positive feedback loop. And as we mentioned, that's a growth. And the negative feedback loop is with more fish, we have more death. We have more death, we have less fish. That's a negative feedback loop, and it declines. However, when we combine those two together, where we get, then the behavior will depend. If the reinforcing feedback loop or the birth is more than death, we will have a growth of the population. If it is less, then if they're equal, then there is an equilibrium. And if the death is more, then we'll have a decline in the population of the cases, etc. So these are the two concepts.
So I just want to summarize this before we jump in the model so that people understand. The stocks and flows are the structure of the pandemic or whatever it is we're studying. That's the structure of how it works. The feedback loops are what creates dynamics between the structures. Would that be a good summary?
Yes.
All right. Let's go to the model. Let's jump in.
Okay. So I'll stop sharing. I'll go to the next.
By the way, while he's bringing this up, the model, you'll find a link in there. This model, you can actually go online. One of the reasons I liked dealing with this is Raafat's got his model online. You can go and you can play around it with all the links we show today. They're going to be in the comments. You can go play around with it, or they'll be in the YouTube. If you're watching in the future, just look in the comments below the YouTube video and there'll be the link there. So Raafat sharing. So this is now we're looking at a live model, correct?
Yes, and it's on a stellar environment. The model is built.
So this is like going in the lab. We've gone in the laboratory now. We're working in the laboratory. We've got this live model. There's some new stuff going on here. What's these new things that you've added? Walk us through that.
Okay, so when I displayed the model at the beginning, I did not show. I just showed it in the last picture. As we said, the flows are where things happen actually. And in the stocks, this is when the results of what's happening, what takes place there. So basically what controls the infection rate, if you can see my screen, it's basically the infectivity, which is how much the virus is able to infect, and the total population, and the contact rate. And the contact rate is that how much people you are going to infect, basically, if you mix with others. And there is nothing happening here except then there is an average duration of illness or death before people are removed. So you can see this is empty. If I run this model, I'm gonna run it step by step, because you can see things don't happen quickly. We just see that this is like when you see the reporting of data. You see you're going, and then suddenly things go up, and we can see that as the infectious population grows, the susceptible decline, the move takes some time before they kick up.
And this is important because everyone was like, they're like, oh, well, the recovered, don't worry, we'll have the recovered. The recovered is a time lag from the infection. It's going to happen, but it's just a time lag. So that was always something that was annoying me in the reporting, is like, oh, where's the recovered? It's like, well, you got to wait. It'll happen.
Exactly. Yeah. I recall a conversation with somebody who said, I saw all these people mixing. There's nothing happening in cases. I'm like, it takes some time before they show up. It doesn't show instantaneously. And that's the trick of all dynamic systems.
So keep advancing this. What happens as we advance it?
Yeah, it will regenerate what we have seen before. Going down, and the number of removed or recovered, this is growing, but the infectious population is actually declining. And
so let me pause here and ask some of the questions that have come up. Okay. Lucas has asked, in order to understand the exponential growth rate in an SAR curve, when fitting it to a given population, do you need to understand the susceptibility factors in that population density, demographics, or does all of that get baked into the R value of the infection in the population? So do you have an R value here?
Yes, I do have an R value. And
there's a
structure for calculating the R naught, which is the base reproduction rate, and the reproduction R. And by the way, even the computation of R naught and R, people have final few tweaks that they use in order to compute these numbers. These numbers represent an aggregation of several things that is happening. It aggregates the contact rate, it aggregates the infectivity of a virus, which, who knows what these numbers are, but people probably go to the data from previous viruses and try to compute that. And that's why when you hear, this is nasty, it's infecting, it behaves different. This is a property or an attribute of the virus itself. And then the average duration of the illness, these when computed, they bring us the value of R naught. And when combined with the susceptible population, and the total population, the value of reproduction, the R is changing. So we know that these numbers also are not constant. They change over time.
But if you wanted to, you know, Lucas was talking, if you could change, like, if this was a more complex model, it's in this structure, just like you had subscripted population. Could you subscript susceptibility, maybe some different infectivity rates by age demographic or underlying conditions? All that could be built in here?
Exactly, exactly. It can be built because we are looking here, we're assuming people in the same place, at the same age group, they mix perfectly. We can disaggregate this to age groups, gender, venues. This all can be combined. But there's one caveat with that. The more you disaggregate, the more you need data or you need estimates to fill in there. If the statistics or the data for all those age groups and venues and gender are available, then okay, you can add that. The more you add details, the more it requires estimations and data. And then we just need to be cognizant that the more we add details, the more we need. Otherwise, whatever we fill in the model will just reproduce what we got.
So there's a couple questions on here about, and I'm going to relay them here. Christine mentions the link isn't working. We'll get that fixed for the YouTube. But Fahad Al-Sabai, I hope I got that right, has asked some questions. About the transmission rate in the infection rate. Is it constant in the simple SIR model? How do we deal with time varying infectivity in the SIR model? Are any of these adjustable, these parameters you have here?
Yeah, exactly. So for example, now when I show that, I'm like adjusting, for example, the contact rate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reducing it. Okay, we need to finish this. We stopped it.
Okay, so we're finishing the previous run now.
So if I have a higher contact rate,
mm-hmm.
And I started, maybe I can run a complete run, just not to waste people's time. This is going behind the hood. I had a pause interval because I want to simulate days. I'll just go and run it for the whole. And let me just run it again. So you can see that.
Okay.
Now, if I did something and I reduce the contact rate.
You can see, wow, it's changing right there in front of us.
Yes. So I can make this to change over time as well, but just for the case of demoing that, this can be a function of time as well. So that's if this is an answer to.
So what does this tell us now? We've got the structure. We see infectivity. We see contact rate. How does that help me craft a policy? What do I learn from a pandemic model about, duration of illness, contact rate, infectivity? What does that tell me about intervention and like pandemic responses?
That's a very good question. Two things we can learn. First of all, if you see this inflow that I started the model with, this is like cases coming from outside. So the policy implication here maybe is that to try to limit the inflow of something that comes from outside in order to just create one protection. Mm-hmm. However, the second line of intervention will be the contact rate, because it's how to intervene with infectivity of a virus, or how would you intervene with changing the population, because we can see the equation up there. The infection rate is the contact rate multiplied the infectivity there, and multiplied the infectious population, the susceptible, and also the total population. These things we can't change. The only thing we can change is the contact rate.
So what are some examples of changing the contact? What does that mean in the, what would that represent in the real world, a contact rate change?
Limiting mobility, for example. This is a way to intervene. When we use masks, we kind of, even if we're in the same place, but would you put the masks, you are basically like acting alone. You're creating a safe area around you. It's not as sealed, but it basically helps in reducing the contact rate. So everything that is being done is probably going into that number, trying to reduce it. And we did,
or increase it if we're opening schools and opening beaches and throwing everyone in the bars. We're increasing the contact. I mean, in some ways, that's the you know, if we wanted, what happens? So you did it, spin the dial the other way. What happens if you go over 2? Like you had the dial, it was at 2, you dropped it to 0.9. Well, actually, do you have a way of showing like a simulation that's going partway along and then something changes?
oh yeah, we can do that. Do you want to do?
Let's do that. Yeah, let's jump into that. Let's see what it looks like with an actual intervention here in a live. So we've seen the demonstration. Let's jump in and maybe have the pandemic go and then try to do a response midway through.
Okay, so you're already seeing now 2 curves for 2 runs. One that has lower contact rate, that it has a lower peak. This is already happening, but we can also do a simulation. We can reset this and start from the beginning just to show that. So let's take this. I need to just put this in a mode that I can run the model step by step, so that I will make it like.
And then you'll use a slider or something to change the you'll change the contact rate in the middle of it.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So what I'm gonna do is just advance the. Let's see if I'm in a run mode. Yes. I mean, if you go into the, we will post a link for this.
I think you need to change your. Are you showing the same model, or have you gone to a different screen on yours?
Oh, I am showing a different screen. Okay, let me.
Yeah. you were describing stuff and the screen wasn't moving, so make sure you've switched your screen there.
That you're not seeing what I was doing, so.
This is really behind the scenes. So far behind the scenes, you can't actually see it. It's classified. It's too classified. If you can't see it, you're not good. Okay, there we go. So now this is a different screen. Okay, so what are we looking at here? Walk us through what we're seeing first here, and then do your.
You know, just a picture of the model. We're seeing here 2 different charts, which are similar, but I split them in 2, so I don't have to jump around between them. And as we mentioned before, that the contact rate is the place where we intervene. And then I have these buttons to advance the simulation, and then I can stop and intervene. So I just created these buttons in order to be able just to demonstrate.
Okay, walk us through a pandemic with an intervention. Let's see what happens.
Okay, so I'll start from the same case as before, advancing my days. And as I mentioned before, although we can see that the curve is almost 0, it's not necessarily 0. But we are advancing, and it takes time.
For those watching, when you have a chart with a large scale, small numbers can make it look like a false 0. What he's talking about, because the scale goes from 0 to 10K, when the numbers are only 10s and 20s, it looks like 0. But once it gets high enough, it starts to appear. That's just a factor of the scale.
Exactly. So now we have like 500 cases. Is it a time to do something, or let's continue? So I would say, like, hey, let's give it a couple of days. And then,
so let's take, this is basically March, right? So in early March, San Francisco and New York, they have a couple cases, and they're talking about it. You know, we've talked about it since February. People are just beginning. We had the breakout in Washington, but now San Francisco and New York City are getting hit, and they're deciding. And I think it literally was a couple days. I think San Francisco and big cities in California shut down earlier. New York went a couple days later. So a couple days, what you're saying, that made a big difference in just a couple days. Like, that really increased a lot.
Yeah, so this is day 20. We have 2,000 cases.
Okay.
So let me go 5 days before. Days 15. Yeah. No?
So we're about 70 cases, just about.
Yes.
So we've gone from, so this is the time delay function that I was trying to get people to think about. In 5 days, this model went from 70 cases to 2,000, and it shows how hugely important that early action is when you're dealing with an exponential growth model, because it just sneaks up on you really fast. But let's say they do something here. Let's say they, you know, this is the US, we've got this, the president goes on TV, he says we're in a national emergency, the NCAA and the NBA cancels games, Coachella cancels, concerts are canceled, businesses begin working from home. All of that you're saying is basically an adjustment to the contact rate. What would that take us to? Take us down to what number?
Let's go to 0.5.
Okay. So we've dropped the contact rate. We did all this And we assume it happens very quickly. Doesn't really happen that fast, but for sake of discussion. So we've intervened now. What happens?
So let's proceed. Okay, we stopped growing. We're still going because there's still a contact. However, if we see down below the infection rate, which is the daily cases, if I would say, it dropped. And thank you, Tim, for saying that. We are assuming that this will be invoked abruptly tomorrow morning. Nobody's leaving or they don't work. That's not happening. So if we go further and further, you can see that, you know, the hospitals are not overwhelmed. Things seems to be in control, and we continue because we can see that the numbers, it's plateauing.
Right.
The plateau. You've heard that before. We leveled the curve. We all heard that before, some way or another. So that's a time when maybe relaxing some of those measures could take place.
So we're gonna, you know, and this is just a narrative. Basically, we've been through late March and early April. We had the super spreader event in New York City and New Jersey, which was absolutely horrific. I don't want to downplay that, but it's very localized. If you didn't live in that spot, it didn't hit as much. By mid-April, what you're saying is we're seeing that those cases had faded by mid-April. By late April, states are saying, hey, let's react. This doesn't look so bad. You know, it's that, yeah, we shut down. We seem to have beaten it. Let's open back up. So here we're talking now at this point in the model, narrative-wise, it's late April. Georgia begins opening back up. Florida opens back up. Probably over the course of May, all the states begin opening back up. So what happens when that contact rate goes back up in, say, late April through early May? What are you going to put the contact rate at now?
So before I do that,
Okay.
just one small detail is that we're looking here at the infectious population and removed, and if the healthcare system is not overwhelmed, there's a good reaction. We see that, you know, the number of recovered is high, you know, so this means things are okay. So it's not only the cases, you can also see that the number of people recovering is also growing. Mm-hmm. So that's put another layer of safety. So now let's increase the contact rate. I would argue that we need to increase it more than it used to be, especially if, you know, people thought that we were overreacting, and that probably it coincided with the holiday or with
Labor Day, or no, Memorial Day weekend. Everyone wants to get out and party because the
people were locked down. Weather is improving, and then people will just go and do their thing. And this can go, for example, let's go to 3, for example.
Okay.
And then go. What's happening? It came back again.
So walk us through the rest of this. Keep going through.
Yeah. So because things are happening instantaneously here, you can see that sharp drop. But since the population, and we're assuming perfect mixing, we've already got people infected. We will see that the second hump, and then it will go down, because eventually it will go down. No doubt about that.
Because in this model, we have a limited number of
yes.
people. Okay.
Number of people, and whereas, as I said, we're assuming perfect mixing, so people just went out and they're perfect mixing, they all get sick and they're recovering. But this is not happening in life. We can do this. We can make a distribution for those timing, but for the sake of explaining this is that's appropriate to show. Oops, sorry. I kind of want to finish the pandemic quite quickly.
Yeah, let's finish it out.
Yeah.
Now, and what would be? Let's say that some country did it differently. Can we quickly put, without going through day by day, can we just do get another graph out there to show a different option?
Yes, we can do that. So if I put, do you want to do like a country that intervened quite early?
Sure. Can we just simulate it all at once rather than step?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see that.
Okay, and then what's a third option? Let's just pick a third one for comparison.
The option is to go safe and then intervene in the middle and do something and open up.
Okay, do that. Throw that one on there if you need to, and if you.
So this one, I need to do it in steps, because without that, I won't be able to
Sure.
intervene. And then once we get, and it's boring when something is beginning. Nobody's seeing anything.
Yeah.
And since we have a low contact rate, you're seeing, once I hit the speed dial, you see the green chart building up, down?
Yeah, very slowly.
Yes, we're having another color, which is the yellow.
Okay.
Now, we need to, it went like 30 days, nothing has happened.
So they're going to open up now.
Yeah, we can go and open up. You see?
Wow.
It shut up. And the reason it shut up also very high, because you still have susceptibles that not infected, and then you open up everything, and then you just go, it will come back eventually.
Yep.
So you can see that you can have a slow start, but then you have a high peak and go down.
That's fascinating. Let's take a look. I wanted to get to, Lucas had a question here. Let me go make sure the question. Lucas is talking about reducing infectivity. Let me go through questions here. Lucas asked earlier, I wanted to get to this, so I don't want to miss it. It was earlier where he said, we've seen this model. Could we do, can we add a simulation where the removed go back into the susceptible?
Yes, we can do that if
yeah, let's try that. Well, let me go through some of these other questions if you want to start doing that.
Sure.
Let's see, Charles, I'm going to read some of these while we're getting that done. Charles is asking, so based on this model and the formula for IR, the only solution is reducing the contact rate. So the question then becomes, what is the most effective way to reduce the contact rate, mask, social distancing, vaccines, etc. Charles, I think in the SIR model, the simple SIR model, there's a couple major, a couple variables. There's the contact rate, the infectivity rate, and the duration of the illness. Now, in some cases, you think of this as a novel virus. The duration, as we get better ways of treating it and doctors become more familiar with it, that may reduce the duration and make it a faster recovery. That's not going to necessarily help the infection though, because you're already infected, you're already in it. That leaves the infectivity rate and the contact rate. Infectivity rate, Lucas is saying that you could reduce the infectivity. I don't know how that's done from a virus standpoint, whether that's something or whether that's another aspect of the contact rate, how the virus itself can change its infectivity. So most of what this model looks at is contact rate, but within that contact rate is social distancing, isolation, masking, closing schools. All those things are variations of contact rate. And what Raafat's doing right now on the screen, you can see, is he's connected, connecting the removed, creating a flow to the susceptible that will take people from the population. Let's do 6 months. Do we want to do 6 months?
Okay.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to model that after you've recovered, you have antibodies, T-cell immune, whatever those things are. We're just doing for sake of argument. 6 months later, you're going to go back into susceptible. So the case here that Raafat's modeling now is, I got this in April. I'm immune to it for now. 6 months from now, say in October, I'm going to go back into susceptible population. And we're naming the flow, what are we naming it? Immunity loss. So this is now the transition of the people. It's like, having a tube from one bath go down and fill in the tub above it. So it's kind of, it creates a circular system now where there'll be a flow. And let's see what happens, Raafat, when this runs. And you got to...
I'd like to add a point to Lucas' comments. The model is equipped to help if there is something that says infectivity can be controlled, then you can intervene there. It's the intervention location is there.
I think Lucas just clarified. He's saying masks go to infectivity rate because the contact rate is just how often different people touch each other, whereas infectivity goes to how likely it is with a contact that they get sick. Am I understanding that right? I think we're for simplification purposes, we're probably including a lot of that that mask type thing and contact rate, but you could say if everyone was wearing a mask and therefore the infectivity rate was much lower because of the barriers, then you could probably make adjustment on the infectivity. Is that correct, Raafat?
That's fine. That's
Yeah.
the purpose here is to demonstrate where to
Yep.
intervene, and
Yep.
at the very end, where all this is leading here.
Yep.
To the so this is okay. So now we're assuming that immunity will be lost in 6 months, and now I'm running the model for 60 days. So I need to increase the time horizon
Okay.
to take place, and so we had 60 days. Let's put a year there. Zoom is interfering here, so let me just 5.
Navigating Zoom is always fun when you've got buttons on the screen you want to touch. No matter what you do, Zoom puts the window right over it.
Exactly, it puts it right over. And I think I'll do it. Do you want me to do a full simulation, or
yeah, just do a full simulation first so we can see what it looks like.
Oh, we don't need a pause?
Nope, not right now.
And one thing to clarify, and this is something I have added in the model, that because of this limited population, that if there is a possibility for new cases to come, again, to start this fire from somewhere, but that we can see also how the, I'll clear the chart so that it used to be at 60 cases. And
okay, so this is interesting. So this is what it looks like when you have a reinfectable population. You get a double hump effect, a double wave at that, and it's funny because it's not even at the full 160 days. It's actually the infection population pops up a little bit earlier, and then you've got this susceptible, and it ends up burning. It's interesting because at the end, walk us through what's going on there. That's a very interesting chart with a lot of stuff going on, Raafat. Tell us what's happening.
I wanted to actually to reduce the scale, but however, we can explain it here. So we know it's first peak. And we know that the susceptibles were decreasing, okay? But then it started increasing. So one thing is that I'm not treating in this model that people stay put here for 180 days exactly, and then they start leaving, you know? So it's not like a conveyor. It's once this is started filling, these numbers start to slip away and leave.
So the average is 180 days, but anyone's individual could be variable based off. Some would be longer, some would be less.
Exactly, a distribution, and not like, hey, it's 180 days, time to.
Your antibodies are like, it's 180 days, we're out of here, pack the suitcases, we're done.
I'm clocking now and leaving, or my job is over, and okay, let them suffer. Or so that's the point when this is declining and this is reaching a certain level of susceptibility, of the susceptible level of the population, and this started picking up, and we can see as this value increases, this is decreases, and so on. This is the dynamics again kicking. It's a repetition of the episode, but it's not as high because we don't have susceptibles as much before to drain from. So this will be like a dance between being susceptible, being infected, and recovered, etc.
And this model is being simple in a small area, assumes that everyone pretty much got the disease the first pass around, which we know for a country like the US, where there's 330 million people, probably 700,000 have gotten it so far. Let's say 1 million have gotten it. The problem we're going to run into is as those million lose their antibodies or T cells in this scenario, if that's the case, they're going to be joined by 318 other million people who didn't get it the first time. And that's where these massive second waves can come from. So this model is a very simple one, dealing with a small population in a confined area, a specific geographic area. There might be different dynamics like in value or scale, but it might still show this second wave function, this double wave.
Yes, and it's not, for example, that much. It's controllable. It happens. It becomes somehow like something, I would not say seasonal or something, but this could. I mean, this model of this epidemic model is used in different epidemic diseases. So it's not just for that. It's the parameters that makes the difference. And I think I made this disclaimer. I'm not a healthcare guy or somebody who is in that field. I'm a modeler, so I'm just taking this mathematical concepts and putting it in a way to experiment. We rely on the subject matter expertise too.
Well, I appreciate that, Raafat, what you've done today. And I wanted to tie this back. The reason this model is powerful is Raafat's not an epidemiologist. I'm not an epidemiologist, but we use these models. People see these weird behaviors and say, could that really happen? You know, we saw that intervention. I want to share something. I actually went out, there we go. I actually went out and grabbed. So this is that with those various interventions here. So on the left, what people are seeing is you've got this double hump formation that Raafat showed. When you had in blue, it's kind of the US model where you have this, and I pulled this from an earlier thing. So you've got, you intervened, you dropped it, but then you opened up again, April, May, you had the second hump, and then it drops. That looks really weird. People are like, can that actually happen? Then this other one, has a later hump that it comes up, but it's just a rise in growth. Other ones have a very slow rise in growth. And what I pulled is 4 countries that demonstrate some of these behaviors. So Gutter up here shows this kind of just single rise and fall. You've got the Netherlands actually is showing very much this initial rise, drop, and then second rise. And the US is actually showing one where the second rise is much, much higher than the first rise. So these kind of weird dynamic behavior modes are actually happening in countries. And I did pull one Vietnam here that shows that very light dashed curve where they've had a very good control. You know, Vietnam's not an island country. It's on a peninsula, but it's not an island. It's not isolated. It's not exactly the world's strongest economy, but they've done very well. And if you look at it, it looks like it's got a sharp peak, but the case number is total cases is 1,000. So this, if you were to put this chart relative in scale, it would be this much lower chart compared to the others. So I wanted to ground us a little bit in reality from the model where we said, hey, here's what the simulation shows. These behavior patterns, even though they look kind of odd, they actually replicate and can explain what we're seeing in some of these other countries with real behavior modes. So Charles, let's see, Greg, it's very interesting and informative. Study of people as a group is predictable, but each individual is different and may or may not fit the rules. So Raafat, how do you deal with that? So let's talk, we're talking now about some modeling techniques. Greg's asking, okay, everyone is different. Everyone might do a different thing. How does your model account for that within a system dynamics approach at a simple level?
These are very good questions. And as I mentioned at the beginning, models are not created equal, and also models serve different purposes. It really depends. If I want to understand the phenomena, I start with a model like this. If I want to model a country or a county, the question would be, what is the purpose of the model? Mm-hmm. Do I want to see what gonna happen in my neighborhood or in my town or at the level of the country? So people can combine such models with models like agent-based models, where we would try to account for different agents or different people with different traits. But you can't also model infinite number of people, but you can make classes of people and then put rules for their behavior. But at the very end, they're also mixed. They will be all linked to similar structure.
So it's kind of like the more different agents you model doing their different things, the more likely you are to end up with an average behavior.
Yeah,
on a large population.
I have seen some charts that show the results of 2 different simulations, some with the agent-based model and some with just a simple system dynamics with some disaggregation. And you probably differ in some noise or some fluctuations because they're able to capture this better. However, if you do it and look only for average values, then such a model is computationally less intensive, and it also gives you a quick insight of what could happen. The other thing, the time it takes to build a model. If there is something happening on the ground and you need to intervene, and you still don't know that much about about how people are behaving or what their reaction is. I mean, 6 months into a pandemic, there are more data, there are more studies. You can populate and inform the model more with more grounded data that can describe all these categories much
But you're
better.
also 6 months into it, and I think what we showed is that early action is key.
Exactly. So no matter what we do, it's the timing that matters. I mean, we can go into sophistication, and I'm not against that. These models would help to live with something, to do better planning, to do better capacity utilization, even to the point of thinking about if you enter in an emergency room, how do you control the flow between going and not mixing with the existing cases?
Now,
There could be so many details that can be added.
So another question, Charles asks, if we have a vaccine, would that impact infection rate, or would that actually move the population from susceptible to remove? So how does an SIR model deal with, say, vaccinating the population? And you can just walk through verbally how that might be modeled.
That's an excellent question. The vaccination will simply drain the susceptible to the immune. You see, remember that flow we created from removed to susceptible?
Yes.
We'll reverse it, because susceptible, if they are immune, you can assume that
so
they are immune.
if we were to look at this model, say 2 years out, and we knew that both and let's make some assumptions. One assumption is there's a vaccine that we can get. Another assumption is that immunity is lost over time. There might be a flow from susceptible to removed and a flow from removed back to susceptible that represent this kind of churn that isn't all that unlike the flu, where every year we get a vaccine and every year we lose the immunity because there's a mutation or something like that. That could be represented in this model pretty well.
Exactly, because, to put this statement into parameters, it's the time to gain immunity to time to lose immunity. And it's this dance between the two. If the time you stay more immune is higher than the time to lose immunity, then you probably won't get it. But if it is shorter, then you probably come back. And that's a good point also that was mentioned, the effectiveness of vaccines. In general, I think 50% is the general effectiveness of vaccines. So there is like a threshold, or there is a value you can try. You can increase it with the sensitivity to make it like 70%, 30%, and then you can see what happens.
Right, when you're testing in the model, you mean these model parameters?
Yes, because I mean, we have a vaccine. What's going to happen? We put a value, and then increase it and decrease it, and then see how this is going to play out.
Well, I don't see, can we accommodate different, Fahad's asking, can we accommodate different strains of virus in one SIR model, or would we need to build a model for each strain? So let's talk about COVID-19, I don't know what the term is. My sister's going to hate me because she's an expert on this, but like Model A, the 2020 edition of COVID-19, which doesn't sound right. But then, so there's variant A, and then there's variant B. Could one SIR model handle multiple variants, and would you use one model for that, or would you use two models?
First of all, this also now goes outside my expertise in terms of how multiple viruses and strains act, but at the very end, they will go into this infectivity and then go to the infection rate. If somebody knows the equation, if I have multiple viruses, how they interact and what the end result of that, we can plug in that equation in the model.
So you could, let's say you were working with someone who was a research scientist and had that stuff down. You could use one model and you could make it deal with the different strains, but they would have to give you the equations of what the right values were and how the interactions were, but then you could represent that in the model.
Exactly, and that's the beauty of modeling and simulation. You as a modeler, you are not the subject matter expert. You know how to translate that into something that can be explained and explored. So working together between the disciplines create that kind of synergy that, what if we do that? Okay, we can try that. And then they validate these outcomes. And then that's how models are built.
No,
and
great. Well, we're almost at hour and a half, so I don't want to go too long, but they've been great questions. Appreciate, I of course always forgot until the end. If you like this kind of content and you want to support it, visit us at www.patreon.com/infomullet. Please share this if you haven't yet, like and follow. We're going to come back beginning of next month, beginning of October, once again focusing on the presidential campaign. So we'll try and do a mix of COVID pandemic updates on the second episode of the month, and then more domestic international issues on the first of the month to give a balance. But Raafat, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate that. I think a lot of the muleteers appreciated it too. We had a lot of attendance, a lot of good questions. If people want to see what these models look like, I see Arnab's poking his head up, so he's if people want to see these models, we'll put the links in the YouTube comments. So you can go and play with it yourself. You can go experiment. I'll include Raafat's LinkedIn. And appreciate your time today, Raafat. I'll leave the final word to you. Any last thoughts?
Thank you very much. I hope this served the purpose of that models are here to stay, and they help us make sense of what's going on around us, and their consumptions need to be, we need to consume them responsibly by understanding what they mean, what their limits are, what their power is. And we know that things develop and knowledge grows over time. And thank you very much for having me. And thank you for the muleteers for being here and for asking all these good questions. Excellent questions indeed.
Great. Well, appreciate it. We're going to sign off. If again, be safe, stay inside if you can. If you can't, wear a mask. Have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right. We are off the live. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a muleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.